Board meetings are for serious investors, Mike smirked, physically blocking the conference room doorway with the casual arrogance of someone who spent the last 5 years convincing himself that title was the same thing as authority. He was holding the door handle like it was a scepter. Like his position as Chief Operating Officer of Brennan Manufacturing gave him the right to determine who could and couldn't enter a meeting that technically required my presence to legally proceed. I was dressed in business casual, slacks and a blazer. Nothing that would have suggested the nature of my actual stake in the company, and Mike was looking at me the way you look at someone trying to access a club they clearly don't belong to. Yet the twist came not from his dismissal itself, which was vintage Mike, my older brother by 4 years and perpetually convinced that his position in the family business made him more important than the rest of us, but from the fact that I was about to walk away quietly, head back to my office and wait for exactly the moment when Mike and the rest of the board would discover they couldn't legally proceed without the approval of someone they just humiliated in front of the entire executive team. What would Mike's face look like when he understood he just blocked the controlling shareholder from her own board meeting? My name is Alexandra Brennan, and I have spent the last decade learning that the most powerful people in a room are often the ones nobody's paying attention to. The company was founded by my grandfather in 1957, Brennan Manufacturing, a mid-sized industrial equipment firm based in Pittsburgh. My grandfather had 3 children, my father, my uncle Robert, and my aunt Claire. When my grandfather died in 1994, he left the company in a complicated structure designed to keep family harmony. Each of his 3 children received equal voting shares in the company, with the understanding that major decisions would be made by consensus. This worked for about 10 years. Then my uncle Robert wanted to sell the company to a larger conglomerate, and my father and aunt didn't. The conflict nearly destroyed the family. It certainly destroyed my uncle's relationship with the rest of us. By 2006, my uncle had negotiated a buyout, and the family had restructured the shareholding. My father and aunt now each own 35% of the company, with the remaining 30% distributed among their children, which meant my brother Mike and I each received 15% of our father's stake, and my cousins received similar distributions from their parent. When my father died in 2015, his 35% stake was supposed to be split equally among his 3 children, me, Mike, and my younger brother Thomas. But my father had written a specific provision in his will. He left his entire stake to me. Not because he loved me more than my brothers, but because he'd seen how I worked. He'd seen how I approached problems. He'd seen how I understood the business in ways my brothers didn't quite grasp. And he decided, in the privacy of his will, that his daughter would be the steward of his life's work. When the will was read, my brothers were devastated. The family was fractured. My mother received a substantial sum, but the business, the majority of the business, went to me. I now controlled 50% of the company outright, my father's 35% plus my original 15% from the family distribution. My aunt controlled 35%. Mike and Thomas controlled 7.5% each. And there was an additional 5% in the hands of a long-term executive from the company who my grandfather had given a small equity stake to decades earlier. I had controlling interest. But I hadn't told anyone. In the years immediately following my father's death, I'd kept my shareholding quiet. Not because I was embarrassed or uncertain, I'd been very deliberate about understanding what my father's will meant and how the shares would function. But because I knew that once my brothers realized I had controlling interest, the family dynamics would change irrevocably. Mike would feel threatened. Thomas would feel betrayed. The delicate balance we'd maintained would shatter. So instead of announcing my controlling interest, I'd continued to work as a project manager within the company. I'd continued to take direction from Mike, who'd been promoted to COO after our father's death. I'd continued to attend family dinners and pretend that I didn't know I had the power to override every decision my brother made. It was exhausting, living that double life. It was also necessary, I thought, for family preservation. Mike had taken to his role as COO with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he always believed he was more capable than everyone around him. He made aggressive decisions. He pushed the company toward riskier ventures. He cultivated relationships with outside investors who wanted to take the company in directions that didn't align with my grandfather's original vision or my father's long-term strategy. 2 years ago, he proposed a merger with a larger equipment manufacturer. The financial terms were favorable on the surface, but the cultural fit was poor. And it would have meant significant layoffs at our manufacturing facility, a facility that was integral to the local Pittsburgh economy and where my grandfather had built a reputation for treating workers fairly. My aunt had opposed the merger. I'd said nothing. But Mike had pushed hard, lobbying the board, convincing external stakeholders, building momentum toward a vote. And I'd realized that my silence was complicity. That by not revealing my controlling interest, I was allowing decisions to be made that didn't align with my values or my family's legacy. So I'd scheduled a meeting with the company's general counsel, and I'd asked her a specific question: if I have controlling interest, do I have the power to block major corporate decisions? The answer was yes. I absolutely did. The board meeting on Tuesday had been called to vote on the merger. The CEO, James Hartford, had sent out the agenda the day before. It included a presentation from Mike on the financial benefits of the merger, testimony from the external investors, and a vote on whether to proceed with negotiations. I'd received the agenda like everyone else received the agenda. And I decided it was time to stop being quiet. But when I'd arrived at the conference room that morning, Mike was standing at the door like he was guarding it against invasion. "Where are you going?" he'd asked when he saw me approaching. "To the board meeting," I'd said. "You're not on the board," he'd said, and he said it in the way you say it to someone trying to sneak into a concert, not unkindly, but with absolute certainty about boundaries. "I'm a shareholder," I'd said. "I'm allowed to observe." "Shareholders don't observe board meetings," Mike had said. "Board meetings are for serious investors. People with actual positions." And I'd looked at him, this brother I'd known my entire life, this brother who'd always made it clear that he thought I was less important than him, less competent, less valuable to the company we both inherited from our father, and I realized that he truly didn't know. He had no idea that his dismissal of me was about to become the most consequential mistake of his career. "Fine," I'd said, and I'd walked away. I'd gone back to my office and called James Hartford. "I need to talk to you," I'd said. Before the board meeting. "What's wrong?" he'd asked, and there was already tension in his voice. James was a good CEO, competent, ethical, thoughtful about the long-term health of the company. But he'd been caught in Mike's political orbit, and he'd been allowing himself to be pushed toward decisions he wasn't entirely confident in. "Can you come to my office?" I'd asked. He'd arrived 5 minutes later, looking confused. I'd locked the door behind him. "James," I'd said, "I need to tell you something that's going to change how you understand the dynamics of this company." "Okay," he'd said carefully. "I have controlling interest in Brennan Manufacturing," I'd said. "I have 50% of the shares. My aunt has 35%. Mike and Thomas have 7.5% each. And the rest is distributed among other stakeholders. This means that no major corporate decision can proceed without my approval." James had stared at me for a long moment. Then he'd said, "You what?" "My father left me his stake in the company when he died," I'd said. "I inherited his 35% in addition to the 15% I already owned from the family distribution. I've been working here quietly, not revealing my shareholding, but I need to tell you now because I cannot in good conscience let the merger proceed." "Does Mike know?" James had asked. "No," I'd said. "Does anyone know?" "My mother. My aunt. The company's general counsel. That's it." James had stood up and started pacing, which I'd expected. Processing significant information requires physical movement sometimes. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he'd asked. "Because I wanted to understand the company's trajectory," I'd said. "I wanted to see what decisions would be made if I wasn't actively exerting my power. I wanted to understand my brother. I wanted to give my family the space to find its own way." "And?" James had prompted. "And I've realized that my silence has allowed us to drift toward decisions that don't align with our company's values. The merger is a bad decision, James. Financially, yes, it looks good. But strategically, culturally, ethically, it's wrong. And I'm going to use my controlling interest to stop it." James had called an emergency meeting with the board 15 minutes before the scheduled merger discussion. He explained the situation with remarkable calm, that there was a controlling shareholder who needed to be present for any major corporate decision, and that her presence had been overlooked. Mike had been furious. He'd said I was trying to embarrass him, that I didn't understand business, that I was using some technical loophole to undermine decisions that had already been made. But James had been very clear, no decision was legally final until the controlling shareholder approved it. So Mike had reluctantly gone to get me. He'd walked to my office with his jaw clenched, knocked on my door, and said, "You need to come to the board meeting." "Why?" I'd asked, looking up from my computer like I'd been doing work instead of waiting for exactly this moment. "Because apparently you're something called a controlling shareholder, and James won't proceed without you," he'd said, and I could hear the fury underneath the words. "Oh," I'd said. "Well, I didn't know that was an issue. My father left me his shares when he died. I've been meaning to mention it." "You're lying," Mike had said. "You did this on purpose. You let me think you were junior staff." "You told me I was junior staff," I'd said quietly. "And I didn't correct you. That was perhaps unkind of me. But my lack of correction wasn't the same as lying." The board meeting that followed was, in many ways, anticlimactic. I explained my position on the merger, not based on financial analysis that contradicted the numbers Mike had presented, but based on values alignment and long-term company strategy. I'd articulated why the decision would harm the company's legacy and culture. I'd asked the board to consider alternatives. And then I'd made it clear that I would not approve the merger in its current form. Mike had tried to argue with me. He'd cited the financial benefits, the market opportunity, the competitive advantage that scale would provide. But none of it mattered because I had 50% of the shares, and that was enough to block any decision. By the end of the meeting, the merger was postponed pending further evaluation. Mike was furious. James was conflicted, relieved that he didn't have to proceed with a decision he was uncomfortable with, but also worried about the family dynamics that my revelation had just shattered. My aunt had called me after the meeting ended. "You could have told us," she'd said, not angrily, but with the kind of disappointment that comes from a family member understanding they've been kept in the dark. "I could have," I'd said. "I should have. I was wrong not to." The months that followed were complicated in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Mike refused to speak to me. He took his frustration to Thomas, who then felt caught between his siblings. My mother, initially supportive, started to worry that I was becoming power-hungry, that I was using my father's will to dominate the family. But I'd also been right about the merger. The further analysis showed significant cultural misalignment that the initial due diligence had glossed over. The company would have lost valuable institutional knowledge and employee morale if the merger had proceeded. Within 6 months, Mike had to admit, not to me, but to the board, that postponing the decision had been the right call. The real change came when I made the decision to formally step into my role as controlling shareholder. I sat down with James and presented him with a 5-year strategic plan that I developed, a plan that prioritized sustainable growth over aggressive expansion, that invested in employee development, that maintained the company's cultural values while modernizing its operations. I'd asked him to lead the charge in implementing it. And I sat down with Mike and told him the truth. I wasn't trying to undermine him or prove my authority. But I also couldn't keep pretending to be something I wasn't. I was the controlling shareholder. That was going to be part of the reality of how we operated going forward. We could work together, or we could work against each other. The choice was his. "I have to live with knowing that Dad chose you over me," Mike had said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "Dad didn't choose me over you," I'd said. "He chose what he thought was best for the company he'd spent his life building. That's not the same as valuing you less." "But that's how it feels," Mike had said. And I didn't have a good answer for that. Because sometimes love and business are in conflict, and sometimes family and fiduciary duty are incompatible, and sometimes the only way to do the right thing is to hurt people you care about. Epilogue. 3 years later, Brennan Manufacturing is performing better than it has in decades. We've modernized our operations while maintaining our cultural values. We've invested significantly in employee development and facility improvements. We've been approached multiple times by companies interested in acquiring us, and each time, we've turned them down. Mike still doesn't fully accept my role as controlling shareholder, but we've developed a functioning professional relationship. He respects the business results. He respects that my decisions have been consistently aligned with long-term value creation rather than personal power consolidation. And I respect that he had to grieve the loss of the future he'd imagined for himself. Thomas has become more involved in the company's strategic direction. He's on the board now, and he's proven to be thoughtful and collaborative in ways that neither Mike nor I always are. My mother has come to understand that I wasn't trying to dominate the family through my father's will. I was trying to honor it. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I revealed my controlling interest immediately after my father's death. Would Mike and I have spent 5 years in this fractured dynamic? Would I have been able to understand the company better if I exercised my power from the beginning rather than observing from the shadows? But I also know that my silence taught me something valuable. It taught me that power without visibility is actually more powerful than power that's constantly being asserted. It taught me that the most important decisions are often made by people nobody's paying attention to. And it taught me that sometimes the price of doing the right thing is the temporary loss of people's understanding, even when those people are your brothers. The day Mike blocked me from the board meeting, he thought he was protecting his authority. What he was actually doing was revealing how little he understood about the dynamics of power in our company. I walked away quietly that day. But I also walked away certain in the knowledge that I would have the final say on how our family's legacy moved forward. That certainty, I've learned, is worth far more than any title or position ever could be.